Now look at this lovely thing. Rhubarb starting to grow. This is my rhubarb telling me it's time to plant certain things, not everything, but certain things. It's telling me it's time to get certain things in the ground. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I thought I'd do a quick video with some examples around the garden to speak to a question I had from one of my viewers, Mickey, I believe. And he was asking about, a number of weeks ago, I made this table. I didn't make the table. Lee Reich, a guest on my podcast, made this table for planting schedules. And you plug in your last frost date for where you live, and then all the dates adjust for when you should put this thing in and that thing in. And it's a nice table, and it's kind of cool. And if that's how you'd like to do things, that's great. And I just jazzed it up with some Excel wizardry, and you can download it from the podcast website if you're interested in that. But one of my viewers asked, about looking at natural signs and letting, the things that are going on in the environment around you tell you when to plant. And to be honest, that's generally how I do things. Aside from planting things under plastic domes where you sort of cheat the season, the other main way I'm just direct seeding in the ground with no tricks, no plastic, no domes or nothing. I tend to take my cues from things that are going on in the natural world. And there's a name for that approach. It's called phenology. I'll put it up on the screen. It's just a natural. Long before there was meteorologists and scientists, and you know me, I love science. But long before we used that approach to determining things, we would look to nature to tell us what to do. And as an angler, I'm pretty. I was a much more avid angler before I had kids. I just can't seem to get away in the woods as much. But that. When I was a kid, my father used these things in Field and Stream called the selenar tables and the moon and all this sort of stuff. But I find when the spring peepers start singing, when the buds and the maple trees open up, when the wild strawberry flower opens up, all of those things tell you a lot about when the fish are going to bite. Different types of fish seem to be tied in terms of their timing when they sort of get going, probably because the things they eat get going at those same times, right? Everything's connected, and there's no reason why you wouldn't use that approach to determine planting dates in your garden. And in fact, lots of people do it that way, and there's plenty of websites you can go to online to look into that. But one problem I have with a lot of the resources out there, number one, they tend to make it sound like witchcraft, which I find really annoying because it's not like some sort of mystical thing. It's pretty simple, right? When this thing's happening, do that. The difference between human beings and just about every other living thing on the planet is that all of those living things are really plugged in to the environment, right? We're humans. We do things a little bit differently. We create our own environment. I have a house I live in. It's 20 degrees Celsius all year. In the winter it might be 18 or 17, save a few bucks on the heat, but I control the environment. It never rains inside my house. It never freezes inside my house. There's always water inside my house when I want it, at the temperature I want it, right? All of my food is, kept just right in my fridge, right? We control the environment around us, so we've lost our connection to the outdoors as human beings. I know there's some really avid outdoors people out here that say, well, I'm connected, and I know what you're saying, and I can even say that. Like, I can tell to a certain extent. I'll come home some days and I'll say to my wife, boy, it smells like spring outside. It really, there'll be days in March where you go outside and, I think spring's happening. It smells like spring. And there'll be days in the fall where I think it smells like fall. There's just a certain smell. I can't, I'm processing a ridiculous amount of sense data. Also, I know what the date is, so part of that's just me imposing my knowledge on the situation. There's even days in late fall where I'll say, boy, today it smells like winter, and I can't, that's the same sort of thing, right? But plants and animals are just better at it than us. Whenever there's some sort of tsunami or disaster, the animals know long before the people, and they're not, using weather balloons. They just know. They're tied in. People that hunt will, be aware of the pressure systems, whether it's high pressure system, low pressure system, and the deer, for instance, seem to be highly connected to that sort of thing. And I don't quite understand it all, and you don't need to understand all of it. All you need to understand is what's going on where your garden is, and what other things you like to grow, how they're connected to when those things start growing. And what I'm talking about is perennials for the most part, right? Your perennials, whatever they are, they're in the ground. The roots are in the ground, and they're not going to start to grow until the ground thaws out, and various stages of their growth is going to tell you how long it's been since the ground is thawed out, right? And some perennials, they'll wait for the ground to thaw and then they'll wait a week to grow. Other perennials, they'll wait for the ground to thaw and they'll wait for 2 weeks to grow. And they're all a little bit different, right? And they have all developed their own ways to not grow too soon. If they grow too soon, they get all this water going up their stems. A hard freeze could damage the cell walls in the plant, right? So they've evolved to have that ability to wait for the right time to grow. And all you got to do is watch them and copy, right? And that's permaculture right there anyway. Watch, observe, copy. But one thing that I find kind of aggravating of the resources online is, and I mean, if this works for you, that's great, but a lot of the plants they use as indicators, I'll put them up on the screen. I can't remember what they all are. And to apologize to Mickey, the guy who wanted this video done, I've filmed this video twice already. The first time there was something wrong with my camera. The second time I didn't have the mic plugged in properly, so it's just me, talking. And yes, I tried to film this every weekend for the last couple weeks, and I keep getting these epic fails with filming this video, so hopefully this one works out. So I had a list of all these things to read. I read it off last week, and anyway, I'll put it up on the screen. And the problem with all these indicators is they're flowers that you may or may not have on your property. And for this thing to work properly, just because lily of the valley is in bloom downtown, it doesn't mean that where you are, it would be in bloom, right? So all of these indicators, these have to be things that are happening right where you are, because they're telling you the condition of your specific microclimate. For instance, and a good example of that is I've got rhubarb in 2 different spots in my garden. I'll show you in a second, but the one part, which is like basically it's against some logs facing south, that rhubarb comes out of the ground and opens up about a week or so earlier than the other rhubarb, and they're 20-30 feet apart, right? So even that's a microclimate, 20-30 feet within my garden. But yeah, I mean, if something, they'll say plant this when the lily of the valley is in bloom, and do this when the lilacs make their first leaf, and do this when the lilac makes their second leaf. And I don't have lilacs. I don't want lilacs. I'm sure they're a lovely flower, but I don't have lilacs. So what I'm going to discuss today is just a really simplified. I plan to get more sophisticated with this over time, and if anybody out there knows of some good resources to direct me to, that'd be great. I'm trying to find resources that are from university extensions, and I keep getting the lilac, lily of the valley type stuff, and not like, plant your squash when the garlic is 9 inches high. Something that ties a vegetable to another vegetable or to a perennial, right? For me, the most useful indicator would be something that tells me when to plant my squash when the garlic's a certain height, or when rhubarb's at a certain stage of its development, or some other perennial, my lovage, right? That's something I grow. When that pops out of the ground, when that opens up, when it's a certain height. That's a kind of metric, right? These are all metrics. A metric is just a way to measure something. So, what stage the bud's at on my blueberries, because that's a food plant. I mean, I grow food, right? I don't grow flowers and stuff like that. I have some ornamentals on my property, but they're at the bottom of my list of priorities. I just keep the property looking nice enough so that if we ever had to sell the house, we could sell it. But other than that, I don't. When I want to see something beautiful, I come out to my garden. When people visit me and I want to show off my garden, I don't show them my flowers. I bring them back here and show them my garden, even though there's nothing going on right now. This will look really nice in a few months. So my general rule of thumb, and again, I'm developing this. I'm gonna, these things take a long time to make note of and make good observations. But if the seed package, you're sowing your seeds, right? If the seed package says sow as soon as the soil can be worked, that means that the seed is tough. If it says sow as soon as the soil can be worked, it means that that seed can take being damp and frozen and thawed and frozen and thawed. It can handle that, right? And it'll just hang out being frozen and thawed and frosted and so on, and it'll just keep doing that until it gets enough warm days where it starts to grow, right? And certain kinds of seeds, even when they start to grow, they can take that cycle. They're just tough. And if you have any apprehensions about whether you're going to be successful or not, just put some plastic over it. But as soon as the soil can be worked, get them in, right? And if you want to think about, a lot of these planting dates, it's not like you can't plant before that date. If it's one of those sow as soon as the soil can be worked, the planting dates are saying it's probably not going to germinate until that date. Right? If it's saying plant your lettuce when the lilac does this, you can plant your lettuce weeks before that if the soil can be worked, but it might not be warm enough for the seed to germinate, but it'll just wait, right? Some seeds are really tough. So like I planted kale last November, and it germinated under plastic about a month ago, right? So those seeds took the whole winter being frozen and thawed and frozen and thawed. Same with my parsnips. I planted some of them in November, and they were just frozen and thawed. So I could have planted them whenever, assuming the soil could be worked, but they're not going to germinate until the conditions are right in the soil. So if the seed package says plant as soon as the soil can be worked, just plant them whenever. But all these different indicators that you see in nature, that's telling you that's probably when they're going to germinate. So if you wait too long after that, you're not getting the most out of your growing season, right? So it's useful to get them in by those dates. But for me, a simple indicator is just when a relatively deep-rooted perennial, something that's like a rhubarb, it's got its roots down about a foot, right? Or this, I'll show you in a second the stage this is at, but lovage around the corner here. It's a kind of a perennial plant that grows. It's a celery, but it's perennial. Grows every year. And celery doesn't grow well here where I am. We just don't have a lot of hot sunny days in the summer, and even with transplants I haven't had good success. I've bought transplants just as an experiment, even then. But this lovage is gangbusters. You get this 4-foot high celery plant. You get one plant basically solves your celery needs for all your celery needs. You can buy it as seeds, but you can also just get it as a transplant at a garden center for $2-3. Anyway, there's another deep-rooted perennial, right? Asparagus is another one, right? When does the asparagus pop through the soil? So, your toughest, hardiest seeds, for me, as soon as you see your rhubarb come up and open, you can do them before that, but once the rhubarb opens, that rhubarb's growing, right? It's not waiting any longer, it's growing. So, if you have a garden, you've got rhubarb, that's a really good indicator. If you've garden, you've got lovage, that's another good indicator. Where I'm lacking here is really good indicators of when to bring out your cold or your heat-loving plants, your beans, your squashes, and so on. I direct sow them, even though I do it under plastic, but you adjust those dates forward or backward according to the whatever kind of microclimate you're able to affect. The indication I've been using for the last number of years, which has been very reliable for beans and squash and tomatoes, is when a tulip flower, the flower has formed and the petals are starting to fall off the flower. You've basically had a perennial grow and finish its whole season. And when the petals start coming off the flower, that's when to sow your beans and your squash and bring out your transplants and stuff like that. Generally speaking, I find that very safe. But of course that begs the question, what if you don't have tulips, right? I actually have tulips in my vegetable garden here because I can't grow them anywhere else on the property because they get eaten by deer. But there's got to be a better indicator than tulips. Maybe the stage of maybe a dandelion flower, or to me it would be when some sort of fruiting thing flowers, because it's most flowers can't handle a frost, right? So maybe when the apple blooms, or when the blueberry blooms, or maybe some really common weed like a dandelion blooms, right? Those things can tell you a lot. So anyway, I'm going to take you around my property and just show you some things that tell me it's time to get planting all your sort of cold hardy things. It's time to get those things in the ground because everything's growing. The more information you can get, the more knowledge you can get from the ground you're actually growing in. The more certain you can be that it's okay to get things in the ground, that it's warm enough for them to germinate and they're going to grow. For me, the very first thing is something I hear. I get up very early in the morning. Most days I get up at 5 a.m. and I tend to go down to my computer with a cup of coffee and answer emails or questions and stuff like that. And at that time of the day, it's still dark in April. And at some point during April, I start hearing the spring peepers in the woods. And that's when I know it's time to get planting lettuce, spinach, and stuff like that. That they'll, I can direct sow those, and at some point they'll come along. But anyway, come have a look, and let me show you what's happening around here in terms of perennials. Now look at this lovely thing. A rhubarb is starting to grow. This is my rhubarb telling me it's time to plant certain things, not everything, but certain things. It's telling me it's time to get certain things in the ground. That is your garden telling you what to do. That is nature telling you what to do. That is phenology. Look here in this garden. This is where I planted garlic last fall. And if you look closely, you can see that it's starting to come up out of the ground in places, right? My garlic here, that's a good, you can compare this to where you are, but it is about, I don't know, 4 inches high, 5 inches high in places. This is my, I've got a number of gardens with garlic planted, and this one is certainly ahead of the rest of them. It's just got a good spot, good sun, and so on, right? But again, this is phenology. It's telling me something's, the ground is warm enough for something to grow, so there's certain things you can plant. Look at my lovage here. You can see it's starting to poke up through the ground, right? These little sprigs here, right? Again, perennial, coming up through the ground, telling me it's time to plant certain things. Things are growing, it's time to plant. That's phenology. This isn't a perennial, but I planted these seeds last fall, and of course they didn't germinate. I planted them in November. It's too cold for anything to germinate, certainly. And these are parsnip seeds that I sowed last fall. And these seeds spent the entire winter basically under ice. This little bed filled up with, the ground froze, and we had different, freezing and raining and snowing cycles over the winter. And this was basically a little hockey rink all winter. Despite that, the seeds retained their viability. I'll bring you in close here. You can see that that's parsnips. I can tell. I just know what parsnips look like. That's not weeds, that's parsnips, and they're growing. Again, here's a seed that's tough, a cold hardy seed. It is growing now. It's time to plant things like that, right? Parsnips, carrots, things in that family. That's phenology. Even this god-awful colt's foot that's growing here next to this rock. I've got it in various places on my property, and I'm constantly fighting with it. Looks like a dandelion, but dandelions aren't blooming right now. But the colt's foot, the first thing it does, it's an awful invasive weed. Kind of looks like, the leaves look like rhubarb a bit. You'll see it growing in ditches all over the place, especially where I live. It's everywhere here, and there's, the seeds fly in. These put a very light, fluffy seed that flies very well, and the seeds just go everywhere. The entire street where I live, the ditches are full of it. And I've done everything. I've kept it out of my garden, but certain places in my yard I've got it. But even this bloom is telling me, hey, the ground where these roots are is warm enough for this plant to wake up, start growing, sending out flowers. That's phenology. It's telling me something, right? Telling me it's warm enough for that thing to grow. Here's a dandelion on my lawn. And there's no buds showing yet, but the dandelion greens have begun. And dandelion roots are a certain depth. So the dandelion can tell you a lot. That's a very common weed that just about everybody has. So the dandelion's a biennial. It's a plant that stays in the ground and comes back every year and sends out, I think they're biennial. I'm not exactly sure, to tell you the truth. Don't hold me on that. But the dandelion is growing. It hasn't sent out its buds yet. So it's at a certain stage of its growth. So I know you can probably plant anything that needs soil. The dandelion's an early plant, so cold hardy plants that can germinate when the soil gets down to like 5 degrees and maybe a little bit hotter during the day, 5 degrees Celsius. I'm using Celsius here. The dandelion's telling you something, right? It's telling you it's time to plant your cold hardy plants because it's showing itself. There's no flower yet. The rule of thumb is once a flower comes out, you can plant your potatoes. I'll have to, I normally plant my potatoes around, middle of May. So it's the beginning of May. Let's see if any sort of flower buds show up in a couple weeks. And give a sense of when it's time to plant potatoes. And finally, here's a strawberry garden where I planted strawberries last spring. So they're fairly well established. They grew all year last year and even produced strawberries under mulch. And when they start to show themselves, that's a sign of a beginning. Let me make sure I've got this on camera here. Yeah, so right here, here's a strawberry. I can just tell by the shape of the leaves, that's a strawberry poking itself through the mulch, trying to grow, right? And I'm sure there's others, and they'll find their way through. You have to resist the urge. I mean, it doesn't hurt anything, but you'll get less weeds if you just leave the mulch alone. But these are starting to poke their way through. Some of my other strawberries are starting to do the same. So the strawberries are waking up. So that's telling me this soil is at a certain stage of development. So again, more information. All right, so that's just a kind of an overview, and I was a little bit all over the place there with this video, but it's something I'm still trying to develop an approach for that works for me, for where I am, based on the things I've got for indicators. I'm really kind of half the purpose of this video is to solicit my viewers for input if there's things you're aware of. And I'm not talking about, I mean, you can tell me all the ornamentals as well, but I'm more interested in, of the things you would grow in a vegetable garden, perennials in particular, does anybody have any knowledge of, when this thing's at this stage, right, is it time to do the other thing, right, that sort of thing? Because all those things are timed together, and those plants are not going to grow and reach a certain stage until it's been warm enough for long enough for that to happen. And that's a pretty good way to keep your temperature on the pulse, or keep your finger on the pulse of your microclimate in your garden. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope that wasn't too all over the place. A bit of a rambling video, but hopefully there's some useful tidbits in there. If you've got any comments, please share them with me. Maybe I can do another video like this in a year or so when I've got a little more sophisticated approach for it. But if you got cold hardy seeds and you're wondering, if you're where I am in zone 6A, I'm in Canada here, if you got cold hardy seeds and you're not sure if you should wait, a lot of people wait till this May 24th weekend. It's the Queen of England's birthday or something like that. We celebrate in here. Everybody gets a day off on Victoria Day weekend. Everybody calls it May 24 weekend because there's usually a bit of beer drinking that goes along with that. But and most people, that's when they start putting their garden in. End of May. That's ridiculous. I mean, lots of things you can plant long before that. Anyway, I hope that was interesting, and if there was anything useful for you, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. And until next time, get out there, get ahead, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.